Welcome back to our series on inheriting assets. I know we've covered a lot so far, but we have even more to talk about today. For those who don't know me, I'm Leah Hadley. I'm the founder of Intentional Wealth Partners and Intentional Divorce Solutions, and I am thrilled to have a very special guest with me today. Jackie Kara is a estate planning attorney. And actually, Jackie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how long you've been doing what you've been doing?
Sure. Thanks, Leah, and thanks for having me. So I'm an estate planning attorney, which basically means that I do wills, trust, and estates. I help people plan their estate and pick the people who will make decisions for them, either when they have an emergency or a crisis, or the people who will take control of their assets and distribute them the way they want them distributed after they die. And it also means that I help the families take care of the assets after a loved one passes away. So I handle probate and trust administration and things like that. I also do Medicaid planning, which means I help people prepare for what happens if you need long-term care. So that's sort of what an estate planning attorney does. I've been doing this a really long time, for over 25 years. So I've helped hundreds of families to sort of plan for the future, avoid crises, and take care of their loved ones.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here because I know that you are a wealth of knowledge, and there is a lot of confusion around the legal aspects of inheriting assets and what actually happens when somebody inherits assets. So, at what point would they reach out to an estate planning attorney, Jackie?
So I would like people to reach out to an estate planning attorney. There's a couple of distinct points in life when I think it's a good idea to reach out to an estate planning attorney. I think it's a great idea to reach out to an estate planning attorney around that point in life when you start to accumulate some stuff. That life you start to maybe make some big decision. Maybe you get married, maybe you have a child, maybe you buy your first home, you're starting to collect a few assets. That's a good time to start making some decisions. You don't want to leave decisions up to somebody else. That's a good time to say, hey, let me take a little bit of control of this. Another really good time I like people to come back and talk to an estate planning attorney is when they have children and they want to make sure that the right person's making decisions about their children. If something happens to them, the right person is control of the assets that will take care of this. That's a very big ticket item we want to make sure we're taking care of. And then when we start talking about retirement, the kids have graduated, now you've accumulated some wealth. Now we want to talk about what we're going to do with that wealth, what's going to happen to it when we pass, or how we're going to take care of ourselves and our families if something should happen. So, there are some distinct points in life when I think it's a really good idea to start talking to an estate planning attorney. But we're talking today about inheriting assets. So the part of my job that's talking about inheriting assets is when we're talking about what you want to see happen to your stuff after you die, or what's going to happen to your family. What does your family have to do to take care of your assets or your stuff after you die? And that what happens to your will? What is all of that? What does it mean when you name a beneficiary? What does it mean when you co-own a bank account? What does it mean when you name a beneficiary? What does it mean when you have a will? So if you name a beneficiary on a life insurance policy, that person gets the proceeds of the life insurance policy after you die. If you have a will that says, I leave my entire estate to my 3 children, everything that doesn't have a beneficiary designation or a co-owner goes to your 3 children. And this is sort of the place where people get confused, right? They're like, well, I have a will and I want to leave everything to my 3 kids. And that's what my will says. So they think all of my stuff is going to go to my 3 children. And then what a lot of people do is they go to the bank and they call the investment advisor and they call the life insurance policy and they call whoever has their IRA or their retirement company, right? And they name beneficiary designations, or they add one of their children as a co-owner to help them pay their bills. And what happens then is that designation is what takes over. Mm-hmm. So if what you want to do is make sure that you're leaving everything to my 3 children, I happen to have 3 children, so I'm saying 3 children, but however many children you have, you want to make sure that everything you have leaves everything to your 3 children.
Right.
and that you're not sort of changing that intention by then going and naming beneficiaries on things in a way that's different than my three children, if that
And
makes
one
sense.
of the things that I've seen people do when we first start working together, before we've had a conversation about beneficiaries and all of that, is to leave it to maybe the oldest child,
Yes.
thinking that the oldest child will then be responsible for dealing with dividing those assets. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of, Jackie, what actually happens and why that might not be the best solution?
Yes, it's a terrible idea. Uh, So I've seen a lot of people want to leave things to the oldest child, or they're going to leave something. I was talking to a client yesterday who said, well, I'm going to leave everything to my sister because I wanted to take care of my nieces and nephews.
Right,
And I was trying to explain to that client, but that's not what your sister has to do with the money
right.
once you give it to her. You hope that's what she'll do. You hope that's what your oldest child will do. You can have lots of conversations with the oldest child or your sister or your brother or whoever that person might be. I've seen people want to do that with a trusted friend. You know, I've had people say to me, but they know my wishes. Um, I've talked to them about it. You can have all the conversations you want, but once you give that gift, that person's under no obligation. You've given that gift to that person, and they're under no legal obligation to split that money equally or share it amongst the siblings or the children or the nieces and nephews or any of those things.
It's such an important point, and it's something that we talk about all the time. And so if you're not sure who your beneficiaries are on your accounts, it's a good idea to review those at least once a year. So that way, you can make sure that they're updated. And certainly if you've had any major life change, that they really do reflect your wishes. But one of the other big things that we talk with people about, and I'm sure you talk with people about, is avoiding probate. And why do we talk to people about avoiding probate? Why does that matter?
So I'm located in New York, and sorry about that, my alarm's going off. I'm located in New York, and New York is a big state, lots of people. The courts have always been slow, right? And it's different in other states. Other states are not as slow. COVID certainly made all courts slow, and I think we're still dealing with that. Probate takes a long time. There's a cost to probate. Most families hire an attorney to help with probate. So if you can imagine, if you write a will and you name an executor, that executor has to be appointed by the court. And that's the probate process. That's what that means, right? The person has to take the will to court and say to the court, please appoint me as the executor. That's what probate means. They have to pay a fee to be appointed to file all those papers with the court. And so that costs money. And then the judge has to make a decision, and that takes time. And until that person's appointed, they can't go to the bank and make any withdrawals, right? They can't make any withdrawals means they can't pay any bills.
Right.
So if there's a mortgage due on the house, they can't pay it. If there are utility bills that are outstanding, you might lose your electric. You might have a car repossessed or an eviction notice that comes due. So there can be some serious repercussions to that delay for families who are really reliant on the assets of the estate. If there's a probate that takes 6 or 8 months or a year, and the family can't get access to the assets belonging to the person who's passed. So
Absolutely.
sometimes we have serious conversations with people about the value of avoiding probate by doing your estate planning differently.
Mhm. So what do you see as the difference when you're working with people who have done the estate planning, maybe they have a trust set up, and have really been prepared, versus those who maybe just had a will, or maybe didn't even have a will, but just didn't take the time for that estate planning?
So, well, I mean, I just finished working with a client who, and this goes back to the beneficiary designation question. This is a young couple. And that's why I say the first time I like to see you is when you get married, you have those kids, you starting to collect some assets. And so a young woman, she's in her late 30s with 2 children. Her husband unexpectedly passed away. he became an electrician when he was 19. And he got his pension and he got his life insurance and he got all those benefits, named his brother as his beneficiary on everything. He wasn't married. She was not even in his thought at the time. Never made any changes. They just never thought about it. She didn't get along with his brother. So when he died, some things she's entitled to by law. Most of his money went to his brother.
Wow.
So she's in some dire straits because they never had the conversation. And they never changed the beneficiary designations. And he, the money's not going to his family, which I'm sure is what he would have wanted if he had thought about it.
Sure.
So there can be some serious consequences to not giving thought to your planning. But I'm working with a couple now, and they came to me because the wife's mother just passed away and she had a trust. And the husband's mother passed away a few years ago and she had a will. And the two of them came to me and they said, we absolutely want a trust because we saw the difference.
Yeah.
Between dealing with the probate and how long it took to get the house sold, to get the house cleaned out, after we had to go through the probate process, which took 2 years before we could get the real estate agent, before we could get the buyer, before we could get the house closed, and how expensive it ended up being, versus the wife's mother who had the trust. Like, we were done in 3 months.
Mm.
Like, they, I had dinner with them this week and they said, we cleaned the house out. The closing was today.
Yeah.
They said, the money's in the bank, the house is cleaned out, it's bittersweet, but it's finished.
Sure.
And it was so simple, and it was in our hands, not in the hands of the court, not in the hands of somebody else. So that planning so simplified the process for the family after the passing.
And so often people think about the cost of the trust itself rather than thinking about the cost of not having that trust in place,
Yes.
right? But one of the things that you've identified a couple of times is there are a lot of extra costs associated with figuring this all out when, there hasn't been a lot of estate planning in place.
Well, there's hidden costs and there's hard costs.
Right.
The hard costs are either, you're going to have the cost up front of doing the estate planning and doing the setup of the trust, which may be a little bit more costly than setting up a will. That's true. On the flip side is the probate's going to be costly. There's
Right.
still going to be a filing fee. There's still going to be attorney's fees. The hidden costs are the delay.
Right.
The family loses the house because they can't pay the mortgage.
Right.
If the family gets evicted because they can't pay the rent. These are tremendous emotional costs.
Absolutely.
That can be avoided with some simple planning steps.
Mm-hmm.
So the emotional toll of having no planning, the emotional toll of, not having things in place when the crisis or emergency arises. It's already such a difficult time in a family's life.
Right.
That people aren't necessarily at their best and they're not thinking clearly. Having everything in place and simplifying it is such a gift, really, than having your family end up with, they're scrambling and now there are financial problems and now they don't know where to turn or where to start.
Right. Well, Jackie, you are just such a wealth of knowledge as it relates to all of this. I so appreciate you sharing it with us. Is there anything else that you want to make sure people take away?
My big soapbox, I want people to make decisions for themselves. I think what people don't always realize about estate planning is if you don't plan, you're leaving decisions up to somebody else. I mean, think about it this way. If you have small children, like this to me is the biggest deal, right? If you have small children and you haven't done any planning for your small children and something happens to you, you're leaving it up to the court to decide who's going to be the guardian, who's going to take care of the money that's caring for your children. And you're leaving it up to your family members to fight with each other over which one of them is going to become the guardian of your children, right? So I encourage people to have these conversations and make these decisions for themselves before your family's in crisis. and an emergency arises. Nobody wants to think about that day. But before you're in the hospital and somebody you don't want making medical decisions is making them for you,
Right.
somebody you don't trust is going to the bank and handling your finances for you, make the decisions for yourself. Right? It really doesn't take that long to have a conversation with an estate planning attorney. And I think people think it's more complicated than it is. Right? And I think most people feel relieved once they've had the conversation.
Right.
So I encourage people to take control of those decisions that you can take control of.
I love that. I appreciate you saying that. Jackie, where can people find you?
I'm in Garden City, New York. My firm is Cara Law, C-A-R-A, and you can find me at www.jackiecaralaw.com.
Fantastic. Thank you again for joining us today. I so appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah.
And for those of you who are watching, we have one more segment in our series on inheriting assets. And next week, we'll be talking about realigning your investments once you've inherited assets so that they really are in alignment with your financial plan.